You are listening to an Art Media podcast.
Yonatan, what's your number?
60,000, as in 60,000 Israelis that signed up for the El Al rescue flights. I'm one of them, so it's 59,999 in Yonatan. The only people on earth, the Israelis, who call a flight into harm's way a rescue flight. I think it's a true demonstration of the spirit of Israel.
My number is 12, and this is the number of European Research Council grants that was won by Israeli research institutes. And by the way, the Weizmann Institute, which we will talk about later, was hit directly by one of the Iranian missiles, won 6. Just Weizmann Institute alone, which outperformed entire countries. So whose number wins?
I'm optimistic about science, and given the hit on Weizmann Institute, I'm siding with your number this time.
I'm from Rehovot originally, so I am siding with mine. I win. Welcome to What's Your Number from ARC Media, where we focus on Israel's economy through a global lens. I'm Michal Lev-Ram.
I'm Yonatan Adiri.
Yonatan, it is 11:30 a.m.-ish here in Charleston. Don't ask why I'm here.
It is 11:30 a.m. here in D.C. I'm here because I'm stuck and can't go back for the last week. Again, one of those, just 60,000 sign up for El Al, but it seems like 200,000 Israelis are stranded outside of Israel trying to make their way back.
We'll get a little bit more into your story in a bit here, but I have to say this is the first time that we're actually on the same time zone, even though we're not in the same location. So that is kind of nice, although the circumstances for you being where you are not good ones for sure. Do you know when you're going home at this point?
Like, I don't. I tried a number of ways to get back, none of which has worked so far. I think overall, this episode is different than previous episodes. While Israel has been at war for almost 20 months, the turn of events last week is more dramatic and more consequential. And me not being able to fly back or being far away from my 4 kids, my wife, and practically not sleeping as we're on opposite time zones. And every time there's a siren and rockets are dropping in Tel Aviv 300 to 400 yards from where we live is a very tough dynamic emotionally. I mean, from a practical perspective, I feel great in the sense of, trusting the safe rooms and the fact that the infrastructure is proving itself to be very strong, but emotionally not being there, not being able to provide that emotional support to my kids and my wife is not easy.
I know there are many others in your position, and it's an awful one to be in. This is a unique episode. Obviously, the big focus now is on the ongoing Israel-Iran conflict. I think at the crux of what we want to dive into is this question of why, in spite of everything happening, in spite of this conflict and the back and forth, the stock market is rising. And not just that, we're seeing other signs of resilience and even vibrance elsewhere in the economy. And so we'll talk about that and also look a little bit into the future and try to speculate. Of course, there's a lot that is uncertain right now of where this goes and when it ends, but we'll try to give a little bit of analysis also of where it could go, economically speaking. Of course, we will first of all start with the Windex and the big shorts. Stay with us. Let's kick things off with this week's What's Your Number Index or Windex. This is our very own index of Israeli-based and or Israeli-founded companies. So, Yonatan, how is this week's Windex looking?
So it's important to say the Windex is from June 9th to 14th. We do that on a Monday to Friday basis. So we have 1 day of war in on this Windex. And Windex, as the market overall, was in a correction week. So S&P fell 1.8%, NASDAQ fell 1.85%, Windex shed 1.54%. So Windex is in the red. Obviously, the most notable rise, and it was towards the tail end of the week, was Elbit System. Remember, we discussed Elbit through quite a number of episodes, as it is one of the big players in the Israeli defense tech space. place, and the market on Friday, having seen the early signs of the Israeli, I would say, advanced technologies deployed in the opening scene of the Israeli military campaign above Iran, has decided to, kind of bet bigger on Elbit. We'll see that growing. We already see that growing this week. And I guess next week on our episode, we'll have a full week in perspective around Elbit, around defense tech, and around the overall performance of the Windex.
Well, we certainly had interesting timing having Oded Ben-David on just last week, and now getting to see Elbit in action, of course, with everything going on, and also, at least like you said, the initial impact on the stock price, and we will see more in the week ahead. Let's move on to our big shorts. We're going to start off with talking about what happened at the Paris Air Show, speaking of defense contractors, where we saw a number of Israeli companies, Israeli contractors, literally being fenced off from the rest of the show. According to the organizers, this was because offensive weapons were not allowed to be on display. But it seems that the story is much more complicated than that, and that this was politically motivated, maybe economically motivated as well, to shut off some of the Israeli competitors. Yonatan, what do you think?
So I think three quick things to say here. We saw President Trump in one of the comments early this week mentioning the strength of American weapons deployed and were on display in the Israeli opening scene Thursday, Friday. And there's a lot to be said about the American-Israeli collaboration in terms of defense and I would say the last mile being developed uniquely by Israel. What did we see? We saw incredible cyber capabilities. Just this morning, we're recording on Wednesday, Novitex, the biggest cryptocurrency exchange in Iran, was basically taken down. About $2 billion of cryptocurrency that was fueling the use of certain dynamics in Iran. So very strong cyber capacities on display, aerial dominance that was achieved over a country 80 times the size of Israel within a couple of hours. Ground NLOS and ATGM missiles, the Spike family that was also on display in the salon. So all these technologies were not just on display in and of themselves. They were displayed in conjunction as a system. There hasn't been in modern military history such a display. So in many ways, the concern in France, at least in my view, the political motivation and concern of, the incredible might of the Israeli technologies as part of the American, kind of military technology space are very clear to me. It's very clear where the motivation is. Israeli technologies don't need a booth. Right? The real world, the defense of my family, of 10 million Israelis, of critical sites at war is the best, proof out there for the superiority of the Israeli defense tech sector.
Let's talk a little bit more about the Israelis who are stranded abroad. This isn't just a number. Yonatan, as you shared, you are one of these people. I'm sure we all know at least one, if not more. I have a cousin who's in New York waiting to get home. There are all these stories. There's really, so much desire to get back home, which is unbelievable and unique, as you mentioned at the top, but also a really, really big challenge. So we are seeing El Al trying to address this, but it's not easy. So let's talk about some of the complications and the little bit of progress that has been made.
First, it's important to understand what's going on. Ballistic missiles with a 0.5 ton warhead full of explosives are falling on Israeli cities and on civilian infrastructure. With the Arrow system and the air defense at this, doing 85 to 90% interceptions, a 0.5 ton rocket falling, on Tel Aviv, on Haifa, we've seen those. is a big deal. So the decision was made immediately at the beginning of this campaign to shut down Ben Gurion Airport and shut down actually all airports. People can't even leave Israel, which that has been also politically contested. Now, the reason is, at the end of the day, an airplane fueled is in and of itself a bomb, right? And so imagine a situation that Iran targets 20, 30 rockets specifically on Ben Gurion Airport, knowing that 2 or 3 would make it through, right? Imagine the size of the calamity of the amount of people injured and the images and so on and so forth. So the initial decision, which I fully support, was let's not deal with this. Too risky. We don't know. We actually anticipated 500 to 600 rockets in every barrage. And it is a credit to the Israeli Air Force that's able to intercept those far out and also to suppress the actual shooting and the launchers. And that we'll get to that in the long play. So that's the fundamental. That's why we can't fly back. And I have full sympathy to the decision makers. While I hate it on a personal level, it makes a lot of sense to me. I think the authorities should withstand the pressure and not open the gates also for leaving Israel. So the challenge of bringing in 150, 200,000 people is not just do we have enough airplanes and so on, is how do you land, get people out and move on without becoming a target. So this is a major issue. We're starting to see this unfold, kind of land and sea and ground. Folks are coming through Jordan and Egypt, which is very hard to do, very complicated. Again, their airspace is also not open all the time. Mm-hmm. We're seeing folks trying to figure out, a yacht or some kind of a naval vessel, tugboat,
anything.
From Cyprus to Tel Aviv. We saw doctors boarding a cargo ship to go back to Haifa port. And we're seeing people trying to figure out, flights. This morning, the first rescue flight, again, that's such a weird nomenclature, rescue flight that actually takes you into harm's way, was launched. We're looking at 200-300 people a time. It's kind of touch and go, right? It lands, it has to take off very, very quickly. This is a very complex problem. And until the time at the airport is going to be allowed for more than one airplane at a time and kind of do the taxi, this is going to be like water drops as opposed to like a full, hose open. So I would say to my Israeli friends who are stranded outside, check in the hotel. Yeah, I mean, this is not going to be, unless we're going to see an American, we're going to talk about it on the long play, an American decision to cut this short, either by deciding to intervene or by enforcing some kind of a stop mechanism. I would anticipate Israelis, taking a good number of weeks for all the 200,000 to come back home.
Well, Yonatan, I'm sure everybody listening is wishing you a safe return home, and for all other Israelis. Let's move on to a very, very different piece of news. This is a tech deal. Again, in the midst of all this, we are seeing economic bright spots for sure. This is an acquisition by Wix of Base 44, an $80 million transaction. This is all about the AI economy. Yonatan, did you see this coming?
So yeah, actually there was a lot of speculation in the tech ecosystem. Maor Shlomo, the founder, this is a bootstrapped business by a single founder, showing to the world what everybody had predicted will happen in the era of mature AI. A single founder, not many employees, creating an $80 million exit in less than 6 months, right? The notion of a single founder, single employee, billion-dollar company, was never as clear as it is right now. I think it's a very clever move by Wix. We discussed that on the Windex a couple of episodes ago because the Wix was underperforming. The markets are trying to figure out what are Wix, what are Fiverr, what are those kind of companies that provide web services going to do with the wake of this, super easy AI whereby people can build their own website very quickly and render Wix irrelevant. Base 44 has, I've used it a lot. We've used it at Aleinu at the nonprofit. The most powerful and basically the real pioneer in a natural language interface for you to develop your own app. I've written apps for my kids on Base 44 for them to prepare. I'm not good at math. My 13-year-old's already doing junior high, very advanced math. I don't know how to help her with that. So I wrote the software with Base 44 that made me look smart. It is a phenomenal piece of software. The question was always sort of, what happens? 6 months after, does somebody compete with you? Because that, keeps on getting better and better. I think Wix proved that it is very hard to compete with already a mature Base 44, and they preferred to acquire it in whole as opposed to invest in its growth. And I think this is very indicative beyond Israel. I'm happy and proud that this is happening in Israel, but, as we often cover at What's Your Number, again, we said this is a bit of an odd episode given the circumstances. This is a very, very strong signal coming out of Israel that is significant globally in terms of how do AI companies allow for bootstrap single founder dynamics to grow. And if I'm a VC, I'm paying very close attention because this guy didn't raise a dime. And there are many of those who with $500,000 or $1 million can build viable, strong, scalable solutions that would rattle the space for early stage investors in Series A.
Yeah, this was Sam Altman's vision, right? That you could
Correct.
have one founder get to $1 billion
Correct.
on their own. I think it's also it's indicative of what's happening more broadly because we're seeing more. I don't know if to call it consolidation quite yet, but we're definitely seeing more deal making among the AI players in the U.S. and elsewhere as well. OpenAI making some acquisitions and others. So it fits into that trend too. What we're seeing in Israel.
Yep. I agree. And I think, again, if this wasn't an episode at war with Iran, we would have expanded on this because there's so much to unpack here from an investor perspective, from a tech, a founder, a culture and dynamics that is so typical of Israel to be first and try this out. Maybe we'll cover this in future episodes, and maybe shout out to Mo. We'll have him on the show.
All right, let's get to the focus of this week's episode, our long play. We talk a lot about sort of the duality, especially in light of the last year and a half or so in Israel, of the ongoing war and the resilience, for the most part, that we see in the economy. And so this is the question today is, why is the Israeli stock market rising, even as we're seeing this big, new, huge wrinkle in the conflict? This is the front that we were all, I think, waiting for and knew would very likely happen.
Yeah.
And so we are seeing that resilience. And I think the question is why, right? So just to throw a few numbers out there to get us started, Tel Aviv 35 is up 36% in the last trailing 12 months. Real estate index up almost 9% this week. The dollar to shekel exchange hasn't budged much. So what's going on? Give us your analysis of why, in light of even this reality now with Iran, with the constant attacks back and forth and the disruptions to Israeli life, the very real disruptions, why are we seeing these numbers up?
So I think I see this through four different lenses. And again, everything we say is true for this moment in time, given the dynamics thus far. Right? So number one is fundamentals, the fundamentals of Israeli and Iranian economy. Number two is the interception economics. We discussed that in our last episode, so we'll take a double click on that. I think the third dimension is the institutions. Israel is a live democracy. Iran is a theological tyranny, and this is now being brought to bear. And the fourth is that overall, the reckoning from global investors, however you look at the macroeconomics of Israel over the last 20 years, was at some point, they're going to have to deal with Iran. So this was weighing heavily on every projection of the Israeli economy over the long term. And so while the short-term cost of the war is kind of, in plain sight, the weight of the long-term growth, given Iran's dominant kind of overbearing position on the Israeli economy, is being lifted as the days go by. So I think those are the four.
You've mentioned before that the Iran threat is it's been baked into the economic forecast, right? So how big of a role does that play in what we're seeing here?
Look, Iran has strategically and openly stated that it wants to destroy the state of Israel. Over the last 20 years, this has gone from, I remember us preparing the speech for President Peres in the UN General Assembly of 2008. A person by the name of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad became the president of Iran and explicitly called for the destruction of Israel. This has been going on for a long time. So if you're an investor, there is this giant, country, almost 80 times bigger geographically, with a very strong military that has Hezbollah, that has the Houthis, that invests in Hamas, that has these ballistic missiles, and openly says it's going to destroy Israel. So if you're when you're looking at this, if you're a global investor looking at the scenarios for Israel, you always have to ask yourself, how does Israel, kind of reconcile that? That weighs heavily on Israel's long-term view. And again, the economy grew, so people focused on that and so on. But the scenario of Iran, actively trying to realize that goal was always there. Now, I think the most important stat in this context, you brought it up, is 12 trailing months, Tel Aviv 35 is 36% up. So when we took out Hezbollah, global investors saw that and said, okay, that's one element that's been taken off. When the Syrian regime, that was a puppet regime for Iran, collapsed as an immediate domino, that further strengthened the macro perspective of the Israeli economy. And I think what the market is telling us so far is it seems like the arsenal, the capacity, what we thought would be a 80 million people war with a 10 million people kind of dynamic is actually David versus Goliath. Israel is smaller, but in many ways, David grows into the Goliath within 12 hours of the beginning of the campaign. So I think from that perspective, that's the weight being lifted from the Israeli economy. Let's see where it goes, and we'll talk about that at the tail end in terms of resolution.
Let's get to, I know I'm going kind of in reverse order here of your points, but the interception economics, because I think that's a super fascinating one. What are the key points people need to know here?
So a couple of facts, right? So, and this goes also for Iran's fundamentals. Iran is a $400 billion economy. Israel is a $550 billion economy. Israel has $225 billion in net cash reserves in the central bank. Iran has basically virtually no reserves. Every rocket Iran fires is $10 to $12 million. These are very expensive ballistic missiles, right? So let's make the quick calculation here. For every 100 rockets it fires, right? Every 100 missiles, 90 get intercepted. 10 are there on the outside creating damage in Israel. The damage is roughly $100 million per day. That's the damages in Israel so far. Okay? So you're launching 100 rockets that cost you $12. That's, let's say $120, $130 million per 100 rockets. 10 of them fall, creating a damage of $100 or $80 million in damages in Israel. Now, when you expand that at scale, right, they fire 120, 150. They're already at $3 or $4 billion worth of rockets fired, and Israel is at $100 million per day. So 4 billion versus 500 million. That's sort of the interception economics. The second piece, going back to Oded from last week, Iron Beam. Here's the number, Michal. 1,000 drones were fired since Thursday night into Israel. 270-ish made it to the border. So that means almost 750 were intercepted along the way by the Israeli Air Force and by some of our allies, I should say, above their skies. And the 250 that made it to the border never made it to their destination. That is zero drones made any damage in Israel. Now, we cannot say for a fact, but I have good reason to believe that that has a lot to do with the laser interceptor system and the economics in and around that. That is a very substantial threat that has been diminished to zero at, we called it last week, double espresso cost per interception. So, traditionally Israel is for short wars and not long wars. Every day in which the war protracts is a strain on the Iranian economy that is probably 100 to 150-fold more difficult than it is on the Israeli economy.
I'm curious also what we can read into some of the targets that have been hit. Let's put aside for a minute the nuclear targets in Iran, energy infrastructure, for example, that Israel has targeted and hit, versus some of the targets that Iran has managed to hit in Israel. Obviously, very, very different strategies here, and we're seeing Iran go after very heavily concentrated civilian population areas, but also hitting the Weizmann Institute, which we mentioned. There's a lab there that was destroyed that does research on Alzheimer's, which is like, heartbreaking, right? I'm sure they will rebuild, and thank God nobody was hurt, of course. But also,
the refineries
Haifa,
up
the
north.
refinery in Haifa. And so talk a little bit about what we're seeing in terms of some of the infrastructure targets and the effectiveness there.
So I think it's important, and in our conversation ahead of recording, we spoke about the price of oil. Israel's very cautious when it comes to those types of infrastructure in Iran. Let's talk a bit about what that means. Iran sells 2 million barrels of oil. That's 2% of the global consumption on a daily basis. It sells it to China, and it sells it some to India, some to Russia, some other countries, because it is under sanctions. So even if Iran exports zero, right, it shouldn't make a big difference on the price of oil. And I think what we're seeing right now, price of oil hasn't moved that much since the beginning of the war, because Israel's been very, very careful not to hit infrastructure that pertains to global oil supply, or that may lead to global oil supply disruptions. Iran, being a tyranny, being very backward, investing most of its money in the ballistic missile infrastructure and the nuclear project, does not refine its own oil. Can you believe? I mean, this is a country with so much oil that actually exports crude and buys back refined oil. So the refineries we hit and the energy targets we took are all related to the Revolutionary Guard and the infrastructure of the regime. So I think that's very important to understand how those play out. The Israeli refinery was closed for 30 days after 2 significant hits. That doesn't really impact the Israeli energy economy if the war does not, I would say, prolong beyond 30 to 35 days. So far, so good when it comes to, I would say, overall, the Israeli market, food supplies, water, energy. We haven't had any shortage so far. So I think that's very, very important. And maybe to conclude, that's the kind of dynamics of why is it that Israel's faring so well. Democracies will forever fare better than tyrannies in these dynamics. There are working institutions. The Home Front Command gets to the sites in the middle of Tel Aviv or Rehovot or Rishon LeZion, Bat Yam, where the ballistic missiles have hit directly. Residential buildings arrive really fast. The casualty rate is extremely low. So I think the institutions of an Israeli democracy that's working are proving themselves to be extremely resilient, whereas on the tyranny side, propaganda, people don't know the truth. Iran has withheld WhatsApp and any other social media from its citizens, and internet. We saw Elon Musk committing to allowing Starlink to operate. It's very hard because they don't have the infrastructure on the ground. But overall, tyranny versus democracy, I would bet from a macro perspective, I would bet my dollars on the democracy, and especially after what we saw in the last 6 days.
Well, and I'm going to add another point here, which I think just adds to everything you're saying, and that's that Israel has had, unfortunately, practice for, since October 7th, right? So I've talked to a few tech companies and just kind of asking, how are you guys dealing with all, because it is constant disruptions, right? And it's fascinating that despite everything, they've been accustomed to it. They've had to do it before, and they know how to, just delegate and offload, workloads to their partners in the U.S. and development centers everywhere that they have, and people are resilient. And so we're seeing that in the workforce, even though, of course, everybody who can is working from home other than essential workers. This isn't new, right? Yeah,
look, that's the fundamentals, right? Israel is a $1 to 3.5 shekel economy. Iran is a $1 to 42,000 officially, but really 1 to a million. $1 to a million Iranian tomans, right? The fundamentals of the economy, its capacity to rely on partners, to your point. It's the level of integration to the global economy, right, provides Israel with that capacity of resilience. And maybe one last point, I think what we're witnessing is the maturity of a new national security doctrine in Israel. Whereas for 25 years, the villa in the jungle thought process of like, we're behind the border, we don't initiate, allowed for our adversaries to build this, ring of fire around us and to activate it at their own volition. In the last 18 months, we've seen Israel gradually kind of building a new national security strategy, which I call the friction doctrine. So we increase friction, right? We didn't just go out into Gaza. It took us 3 to 4 weeks to figure out how to do that. We didn't go into Lebanon and Hezbollah only 9 months after they've, kind of created a lot of bleeding for Israeli, military infrastructure, and we didn't, significantly respond. After the beeper thing, like things gradually happened. And so the Israeli economy and the Israeli public, kind of figured out how to live with that. I think, though, that when it comes to Iran, it's different. First of all, level of interruption and damage is higher, but Israelis feel, if I can sort of represent that, but I think it's sort of an overarching kind of feeling. This is our last fight, right? This Iran is behind everything we suffered in the last 18 months. And the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu decided Thursday night, with all the political bickering and him being unpopular and so on and so forth, the public rallied behind him and rallied behind this military campaign, because we do understand everything we've been going through in the last year and a half had one brain, had one heart, had one sort of driving hand, and that's in Tehran. And so people are kind of taking a deep breath. This week has been harder than the previous, 65, 70 weeks, no doubt. But people understand that that's sort of the price to pay for lifting, this Iranian octopus from our shoulders.
So let's wrap up here, Yonatan, with a little bit of a look toward the future. Everything we discussed pretty much up until now is a look and an analysis of what we're seeing currently. A lot of questions on what's next and where things go economically, depending on that. And I think that the obvious, big question is, what does the U.S. do next? What's the U.S. involvement? Because obviously, you mentioned this earlier, that will impact how long this takes, when it ends. And so I guess, for starters, just give a really quick take on what you think the possible scenarios are from U.S. involvement going forward.
So look, there is no positive resolution, I would say, that is finite. Nothing is finite, but kind of gets you to the finite line without either an Israeli campaign in Fordo or an international decision to support led by the U.S. President Trump was reluctant for a number of days to opine and to provide his opinion. I think yesterday we saw, that was Tuesday, we saw a change in the rhetorics. I think what's important is what President Trump had to say to Tucker Carlson and some other wings of the party to kind of say, I'm in charge, I'm the commander-in-chief. This is not about politics. This is about Iran not having a nuclear weapon. I campaigned on that. Mm-hmm.
I say what America first means.
Exactly. Yeah. Owning the narrative, mm-hmm. right? So for me, that's a very interesting point. I would say if I had to kind of capture where we are right now, we are in a Hiroshima moment, right? Remember how Hirohito, the emperor of Japan, was basically told, unconditional surrender. You'll be able to live, you'll be able to lead your country, but under an unconditional surrender. And when he persisted in not surrendering, the atomic bomb landed in Japan. And folks don't remember, but there was an interval of a few days before the second bomb hit. So the obstinance of Emperor Hirohito is, I think, reflective of what we're seeing right now from Khamenei, the supreme leader, so-called supreme leader of Iran. So I think what the president's been doing over the last 48 hours is to basically drive a similar dilemma. So put Khamenei in Hirohito's shoes. You have a choice here. You can, surrender unconditionally, and there will be consequences, but the regime will not necessarily fall, because that's not our goal in this campaign. Our goal is to make sure you don't have a nuclear weapon. To which Khamenei answered a couple of hours ago, to quote Churchill, we shall never surrender. And, my Iranian grandfather used to say, for 3,000 years, He didn't call it Iranian, he called it Farsis, Parsim. We, the Farsis, lost all wars, but never lost a negotiation. And I think what Khamenei just said is, I'm not going to lose this negotiation. I'm not going to cave in. If it means my people are going to die, for my honor as a supreme leader, then so be it. Now, what of that is theatrics? And maybe in the back sort of channel, there is, I would say, another 24 hours until the president decides to act. I think there is, and I think he wants to see a capitulation. Absence of that, I would expect America to convene and for the president to make the decision that is best for America. And one last comment here, I side 100% with Prime Minister Netanyahu on this. He was asked yesterday, should America do it? Does Israel ask America to do it? And Netanyahu said, our military plans are to do it ourselves. And we leave for America to do what America finds at its best interest. And I think that's the way to look at it. And the Hiroshima dilemma that President Trump drove down to Tehran, I think is a very clever framing, such that if there is any military action, it's very clear who made the decision. The ball is in Khamenei's hands.
Well, for what it's worth, I'm not seeing many people refer to President Trump as Taco this week. So there's that.
Yep. You can't prophesize. These are the tools through which I think we can and should look at the next 72 hours and sort of where we're going next.
Well, we began our show with the numbers of the week, and as usual, we will end with our words of the week. And Yonatan, I'm going to let you do the honors this week.
So Maor Shlomo, the founder of the bootstrapped $80 million exit, Base 44 from a few hours ago, published this on Twitter. And I think it is a quintessential Israeli resilient tech entrepreneur take. And here's what he has to say. I believe we have a real shot at building something transformative. The amount of love and support that Base 44 and I received so far from the community has been unbelievable. We have everything we need to win and the backing of the best possible partner. And then he signed LFG, which is let's fucking go.
I think
this
we
is
can
in the middle
say
of
that.
a war. We are in the middle of a war. This is an acquisition that is so indicative where the economy is going, where the ecosystem is going. And you see the strength and the resilience and the positive attitude that is just, striking and optimistic and inspiring from the team. So I think these are strong words of the week.
Well, and speaking of positive attitude, I'm going to commend you, Yonatan. You're in a very, very tough situation being away from your wife and kids with everything going on, and hoping you get home soon.
She's amazing from a practical perspective. She's leading it, like a real leader. I don't think there's anything to be concerned on the practical side. Just emotionally, I want to be there for her. I want to be there for the kids.
LFG.
LFG, exactly.
All right, that is it for today's show. Thank you for tuning into ARC Media's What's Your Number? We hope you found it interesting. And if you did, please be sure to like, subscribe, rate, review, you know the drill. But most importantly, please share it with others who you think will find it interesting. If you want to make suggestions or share your feedback, please reach out to us at whatsyournumber@arcmedia.org.
What's Your Number is produced by Ilan Ben Attar and edited by Michal Lev-Ram. Sound and video editing is by Martin Huergo. Our theme music is by Midnight Generation. I'm Yonatan Adiri.
And I'm Michal Lev-Ram. See you back here next week. This podcast offers general business and economic information and is not a comprehensive summary for investment decisions. It does not recommend or solicit any investment strategy or security.